This week on the Vinyl Guide, we are proud to have with us a gentleman who's lived and loved music, played with so many of the greats, including Duke Ellington, Sonny Rollins, Dizzy Gillespie, Lee Morgan, and so many more. He's a bass player who's on some of the most legendary jazz albums by Blue Note Records. He's an inductee to the International Association for Jazz Education Hall of Fame, served as a chairman for the jazz panel for the National Endowment of the Arts. He's an active professor of jazz bass at the Manhattan School of Music. Wow, it just goes on. Larry Ridley, ladies and gentlemen. Larry, are you a doctor by chance?
Yes, I have a doctorate from the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore.
Excellent. All right, so I'm going to call you Dr. Larry then. That's perfect. All right, I'm not going to have to buy you a degree from Mexico for $75. You've actually earned a proper doctorate.
Okay.
That's good. Okay, excellent. So, Larry, we recently saw you on the Lee Morgan documentary. I Called Him Morgan, which was, of course, about Lee's life, the successful and tragic life of Lee Morgan. We'll talk about him shortly, but before that, let's review your resume. You've played with Thelonious Monk, Dizzy Gillespie, Sonny Rollins, Freddie Hubbard, Art Blakey, Red Garland, Hank Mobley, Ornette Coleman, Donald Byrd. Anyone I'm leaving out?
Jesus.
Well,
Just kidding. Just kidding.
I hate to give you the news. At some point, Larry, I think you're going to be in his band too. How did it all get started? What was it like being a young Larry Ridley?
Well, first and foremost, I have to pay homage and appreciation for my family, and my family on both sides, my mother's side and my father's side, but also two great parents who just really I love dearly, and I still think about them constantly. You know, they exposed me to a lot of things, and I became involved with music from an early age. They both were two great dancers. I mean, like they were ballroom dancers. I'm talking about they were Marge and Gower champion of African American.
So it sounds like a very musical household. Did your folks play any instruments?
No, they didn't. That's what's interesting because I get asked that question a lot. They didn't play, but they loved music, and music was always in the house. And how I really got involved as far as jazz was concerned, they were Duke Ellington and Count Basie fans, you know. So that was how I got exposed to jazz, hearing it in my household. And my mother's youngest brother, who was a teenager when I was at the early age, you know, he was hanging out, and that was when the bebop craze, and he was hanging out with his guys, you know, they'd be wearing the goatee and the mustache and the bebop glasses and berets, you know. But this club that was on Indiana Avenue, which was just a few blocks away from where we lived, in the apartment complex, they had all the guys coming in. Then during those days, in the early 40s, they had wooden telephone poles, you know, and they put up these posters on and tack them up. The guys would come around and tack them up on the thing. And I remember seeing pictures of, you know, like Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, all of these people. And this Sunset Terrace was a club that was, you to go in, you had to go downstairs. But of course, being a kid, I couldn't go. But the back window, I used to go around to the back, and I would sit there and just listen to the musicians. I could hear them, you know, coming through the window at the back of the building. So that's why I really started hearing a lot of the jazz, I mean, live rather than just on the radio or whatever, you know. And then there were a lot of great musicians that were around me all the time. That as I grew older, I knew the Montgomery brothers, Montgomery, Wes Montgomery, and Buddy Montgomery. And there were a lot of great musicians. Jimmy Coe, a saxophonist, who replaced Charlie Parker in one of the bands during that bebop period, and so I had all these musicians and all these people around me, and just listening to it all the time and hearing it on the radio and everything. That's really just sort of insulated my desire to become a musician.
And at what point did you start to migrate to the bass?
Yeah, it was, well, as a little later, I was I was hearing jazz and I always wanted to play, but I couldn't. And I remember seeing all these posters, like I said, Charlie Parker would come in and perform at the Sunset Terrace and all these people, and I started listening to this music, and I said, okay. And I went to the jazz at the Philharmonic, and this is a thing that I always shared with the great Ray Brown, bassist, with Oscar Peterson, and I went to the jazz at the Philharmonic because my mom was saying, well, you've got to make up your mind what kind of instrument you want to play jazz on. And I heard Ray, and I used to tease him about that, about how I heard him with Oscar Peterson and his trio, and I said, oh, that's it, the bass.
Don't feel bad. I listen to Ray Brown, and it makes me want to play bass too. So it's.
And he became like a big brother to me, throughout. I was with him. I met him in Indianapolis, through my encountering him and hearing him play there. But I was with Ray in Indianapolis the time when he passed. He was playing at a club in Indianapolis. I happened to be there just for passing through for a minute, and I would go to the club where he was playing and hang out with him. And he was a part of the older school of musicians, that get to the gig early, have something to eat, and tune up his instrument and get ready to go on stage, really professional, And when I went to the club, and about the second or third night that he was performing there in Indianapolis, because I was just visiting, and I was waiting around, and I got there to the club, and I said, where's Ray? This is very unusual. Because I remember the night before, this particular night, when we were wondering where he was, some guy had come by, and it was, in Indianapolis, it gets hot in the summertime. I mean, in the 90s, and the humidity is,
steamy.
Boy, you're like stepping into a sauna bath or something, And I was telling, the temperature was in the 90s, and so this guy came by as we were sitting in the booth while he was eating and getting ready to go on stage. And the guy said, "What time's tea time, Ray?" Ray said, "Okay, meet me at 6 o'clock in the morning." I said, "Hey, Ray, man, what you doing, man? You're working until 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, and you're talking about meeting this guy to go out on the links, and it was hot and the humidity and everything."
And he was in his 70s or something around that time, wasn't he?
Oh yeah. But he was an avid golfer. He loved to play golf, just like he liked to play the bass. He was really into it. So when I came back the night after, this guy asked him what time was tea time, and he insisted he was going to go, And I get there, and Ray hadn't shown up, which I said, this is unusual. What's happening? And so I was waiting around, and then all of a sudden, the people at the club received a phone call from the hotel where he was staying, and they said, you must come to the hotel because there's a problem with Mr. Brown. And we all said, oh, shit, what's happening, with Ray, So we jumped in people's cars and went to the hotel where he was staying. And I'm telling you, it hurt me to my heart to see them wheeling Ray out. He was in a fetal position. He had taken a nap, and he just didn't wake up. And watching him come out on that gurney, I mean, it's a thing. It's like a film running to my head, even as we speak. It was wild. So I always say, I met Ray in Indianapolis, and I said goodbye to him in Indianapolis, and he was he was like a family person. He was like a big brother to me. I used to tease him. I said, Ray, you're the cause. He said, yeah, but Larry, look what you're doing, man. you've you've grown yourself and you playing your butt off. I said, well, thank you. Coming from you, I appreciate that. But he's my early idol that started me, and then I sort of gravitated listening to Oscar Pettiford, and then when Paul Chambers came along, because he was a young guy just like I was at that time, and I heard Paul, and I said, oh, and he became like a big brother to me, and we used to hang out all the time, and oh man, I love me some Paul Chambers and Doug Watkins and all the great musicians, Milt Hinton, all these guys, Red Callender, Slam Stewart, they all took me under their wing, you know.
In Indianapolis, you were listening to bebop, you were listening to jazz, you were practicing and playing with different bands as a young man. Your parents were dancers, so obviously they were exposed to what was happening in the clubs, and I'm sure they knew about musicians. Were they comfortable with you taking up that lifestyle?
Didn't bother them, you know, because, you know, jazz was very much a part of the whole African American experience, and people loved the music. They didn't really have any sort of negative feelings about it, you know, in terms of some of the habits that some of the musicians had. They didn't think about it from that perspective. They were just thinking about the music and just how great these musicians were and how they made them feel. And the musicians played for dancing too, and my mom and dad were just two beautiful dancers. I mean, they were like Vernon and Irene Castle in Technicolor.
Mm-hmm.
I used to love to watch them. They both were smooth on the dance floor too. I mean, really smooth.
But I'm sure they weren't naive to the, like you say, the habits that were prevalent in the jazz, and not even just jazz, and really with a lot of musicians, those habits are around. So they were comfortable with you. Did they ever give you any advice as you were moving towards becoming a musician for a living?
No, not really, because most of the folks, they didn't think about all that extracurricular stuff, you know, like guys drinking or using drugs or anything like that. They were more into the music because they all had record collections, and my mother's youngest brother, he was into the bebop thing, so you know, he was even dressing like the beboppers and stuff like that, and they didn't really focus on it from that particular aspect of it. It was just recognizing these great musicians and loving the music.
Well, that's very brilliant and open-minded. That's wonderful. So you went from Indianapolis at one point to New York. What was that transition like?
Just to show you how beautiful my life has been, Slide Hampton and his family, they were all a part of the musical scene there in Indianapolis too. Slide came through and sat in at the club, and we played together. And so he said, Larry, I'm going to send for you because I want you to join my group. That's when he had his octet. And he sent for me, and I got on the bus, took my bass, and met them in Pennsylvania, in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And that's where I joined Slide's octet. And oh man, and I have to mention the fact that Conte Condoli, the great trumpet player, he was from Mishawaka, Indiana, and he had Slide and I to come and play with his band too, which was really nice. Where he had come back come back east to perform. Because he was a part of that whole scene out there. He and his brother Pete Condoli, they were both very much into the West Coast jazz scene, and so Conte was really very nice. And I ended up working a gig with him. Benny Barth was the drummer with us, who unfortunately just passed away. Very fine drummer. So here I was playing with all these guys, you know, as a teenager, and then Freddie Hubbard and myself and James Spaulding. We just came up with, and the Montgomery brothers, we were like family. They treated us like they were just the young brothers. And I came to New York with a gig because I met Slide and the octet in Pittsburgh. They were playing at the Crawford's Grill up on Wiley Avenue, up on the hill. and came on into New York and moved to Brooklyn. Stayed at first at Slide Hamptons and Brownstone on 245 Carlton Avenue. And I mentioned that because Eric Dolphy lived about 2 or 3 blocks away from there, and he wrote a tune called 245, and that 245 title of the song was about 245 Carlton Avenue, because there were a lot of musicians that stayed at Slide's Brownstone, And it was nice, man. And I met Ronnie Matthews and Randy Weston. Oh, man, all the wonderful musicians out of Brooklyn.
Was it difficult making a living as a musician back then? I mean, or did you do it full time, or did you have to have another job to support yourself?
No, it was full time. I was playing. Mm-hmm. And then it wasn't as expensive to live like it is now. Salaries were different. But still, I made enough to really be a full-time musician. I never had to work any kind of outside job or anything.
It was comfortable, or was it just kind of was it a bit meager at times?
I never even thought of it that way. I was happy to be in New York. I was in New York City and getting around. The first time I went up to Harlem and the Apollo and all the musicians. They used to have all the jam sessions up there, and I met all these great musicians. And I met Randy Weston, and Randy was really very nice to me. And he took me under his wing, and to this day, I mean, I love Randy Weston because he's been like a big brother to me. And I learned a lot from playing with Randy too. And during that time, Booker Irvin, a great tenor saxophonist, was playing with him too.
And so this is, I want to say, is this the late 50s, early 60s that you moved to New York?
Yeah.
Okay. And
first came in 1959.
Okay. So you set up shop in 1959 in New York, and from there, is that pretty much the only place you've lived?
I lived, I lived in this city, I lived in Brooklyn, several places in Brooklyn. Got to know all the Brooklyn musicians, like I mentioned, Randy Weston and Cecil Payne, a whole bunch of great guys that were all wonderful musicians, and people that I looked up to. I was happy to be around these guys, and they just took me in like I was a young brother, Mm-hmm. And I lived there in Brooklyn, several different locations in Brooklyn for several years, and then I had an opportunity. I was going back to school. I used to work a gig on Little West 12th Street in Manhattan that was owned by a young lady by the name of Sue Yellen. She had me. I would play duo gigs there, and I had different guys that would play. It was just a piano and bass gig there on Little West 12th Street in the meatpacking district. And it was nice because in the evening, the meatpacking, everything was closed down, so the music didn't bother anybody.
Make as much noise as you want. Yeah.
Yeah, it was great, man, and it was really fun. And different piano players played with me. I had Harold Mayburn, Walter Bishop Jr., Ronnie Matthews, Cedar Walton, just different guys that played, because I had the house gig, the house duo gig.
Now, how did gigs work in those days? Like, for instance, you had your circle of some of the constants like Freddie Hubbard. Did you guys set up a gig with jazz group for a certain period of time at one club, and then a few weeks later a different configuration at a different club? How did you go in between the live gigs and work that whole system?
Well, there were a lot of gigs because there were a lot of clubs. Like in Brooklyn, you had the clubs there in Brooklyn, and also uptown in Harlem, and then Birdland. I worked in Birdland. That's how I first met Miles Davis back in 1959, 60, around in that period. And Miles and all the cats used to come in Birdland, the original Birdland, where you went downstairs there. Mm-hmm. And
was that with Pee Wee Marquette?
Pee Wee Marquette was there.
You got a story on Pee Wee?
Oh, there's so many stories about Pee Wee. Pee Wee, he would always he'd always be talking about when he'd bring on the band. He would have his little thing. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Birdland, the home of jazz. And he would announce a group, and he'd announce all the guys, you know. He was quite a character, but he was a beautiful guy, man.
I heard if the musicians didn't tip him, he mispronounced their names.
Yeah, he did have a little thing like that he would do. He never treated me like that way, but he would come up to me, he would say, "All right, now, Papa, you know, I made all them guys famous, you know, Art Blakey and different ones, you know, and you hear me on those records, the Blue Note records, announcing the bands and stuff like that." He says, "Now, come on, you give up a little something there now, you know, I'm bringing you on and announcing you." He was a lot of fun, man.
I imagine what a character. So you're playing all these different gigs. Like you would go up to Birdland and play for. Would you book a gig for a couple of weeks, or was it just night by night? How would the scheduling? What were the logistics around that?
Well, one of the things that happened, I've always gotten along with people, and one of the gentlemen that part of the management of Birdland, he took a liking to me, and he used to give me Monday nights, because Monday night was the night that they would have just groups performing, you know. So I would bring a group and play on Monday nights, and the whole scene there, everybody used to hang out there. I mean, Miles, Coltrane, Sonny Rollins, I mean, you just name it, Hank Mobley, you know, all the cats used to hang out. It was Walter Bishop Jr. I mean, there's so many guys that I could name, you know. And Cedar Walton was one of the guys that came down. There's so many guys that Jimmy Garrison, and then train and see. I lived at 245 Carlton Avenue when I first came, and John Coltrane's cousin Mary, that he wrote that song Cousin Mary for, she lived on the floor below me where I was living in Slides Brownstone at 245 Carlton Avenue. And her husband, Charles Greenlee, was the trombone player in Slides Octet. So that's how I came to meet John Coltrane and to hang out with him personally. Love me some John Coltrane, too. He was beautiful.
What was John Coltrane like?
Oh, he was just a very serious-minded guy. You know, I'd go out and hang out at his house when he lived out there in Jamaica, Queens, and John would be talking. And, well, cousin Mary, his cousin, like I said, lived on the floor below me, so he would come by, and that's how I got to meet him. And John was just so humble, you know, and just a great personality, you know. I think about him a lot, you know, and he was so nice to me, you know, and he didn't make me feel like like he didn't have no kind of star attitude or nothing like that. And you could tell that from the way he played, man. I mean, because this dude, man, boy, you talking about somebody that plays their ass off, man. Ooh, John Coltrane. And Sonny Rollins, all them cats. You know, there was a whole bunch of guys around, too, you know, like Ben Webster and Ike Quebec and Hank Mobley and Benny Golson. It was, oh, man, there were so many wonderful musicians, man. And you'd be hanging out with these cats, man. You know, I was in seventh heaven.
How many hours a day would, say, Coltrane or Sonny Rollins, how many hours a day would they practice?
Well, both of them were practice fanatics. Because I remember one time Freddie Hubbard and I went by Sonny's apartment. He lived down in Lower Manhattan on East Broadway. In fact, he wrote a tune called East Broadway Rundown. And what happened was that Freddie and I went into the building that where Sonny was living, and we could hear him practicing. And so we knocked on the door, you know, and he still kept practicing. I said, well, maybe he didn't hear us or something, maybe, because we went uninvited or anything. We were just going to hang out, you know, and talk with Sonny Rollins, you know, and so we knocked on the door, and we stood there for a while. Sonny still kept practicing. We could hear him through the door, you know, practicing. And so after a while, I said, well, maybe he can't hear that we out here, you know. So I knocked on the door and I gave like a little thing like knock, 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 knock. And so then the next thing I know, after a while, I did knock, 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 knock. So the next thing we know, after about 20 minutes, Sonny came to the door. He didn't open the door, but he knocked back. So when I said knock, 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 he said knock, knock. And that was it. He didn't let us
in. He just let you know. Yeah, okay, I heard you. Now go away.
Oh, man, some of these guys, man, I love these guys. So some of the personalities, man, of all these great people that I've had the pleasure of knowing and being taken under their wing.
Let's spend a little time talking about some of your recorded work. I think some of your earliest stuff was with Freddie and Blue Note. Mm-hmm. Freddie got the deal with Blue Note. How much preparation was there for recording something like his album Hubcap?
Well, you know what was beautiful about doing the recordings with Blue Note Records was Alfred Lyon and Frank Wolf. We used to tease and call them, you know, since it was Frank Wolf and Alfred Lyon, we call them the Animal Brothers, teasingly.
Yeah.
And Blue Note had a whole thing going, whereas we would rehearse a couple of days before going out to Rudy Van Gelder's to record. So when we went there, you know, they had it set up so that you didn't spend a lot of time like having a lot of alternate takes and stuff like that. They didn't want to do all that, you know.
It was all business when you got there, yeah.
Oh yeah, and the musicians like that too, because, you know, we remember Savoy Records and Herman Lubinsky, you know, putting out all those alternate takes of Charlie Parker that he put out. And we said, no, man, we don't want to give them too much in the can. So, they, you know, because you were getting paid by the record session. And so when they put out some of these extra records with a take from some other time or whatever, you know, a lot of times, you know, as the sidemen particularly, we didn't get paid extra or anything like that, you know, in many cases, because that's just the way it was. So they always try to keep the rehearsals and the takes that we would do on the recording sessions at a minimum. And Rudy Van Gelder was just beautiful, man. I love Rudy, man.
Can you, like, what was it like being in his studio? What was the Rudy Van Gelder studio like from the inside?
Well, I never recorded at the first place that he used to do, like with those early Prestige recordings that he used to do, I understand, in his living room. But he had his studio that over there, the studio that still remains over there. And we used to go out there, and like I said, we'd do 2 days of rehearsing, and then we go and record. And it was always a nice atmosphere. Rudy was my favorite recording engineer. That I had made quite a few records that Rudy was the recording engineer. He was a genius.
Like, what would he do that because he's got such a sterling reputation, and you know, there's no question about his capabilities and his taste. But in your opinion, what really made Rudy Van Gelder that much of a legend?
Well, it was his sort of natural instincts at recording. I mean, he knew how to set up everything so that he got the proper balance. And like I say, Alfred Lyon and Frank Wolf, they would make sure that we had 2 or 3 days of rehearsal, so that when we went into the studio, it wasn't a thing of doing like 1,001 takes that can happen. You know, if somebody bumps the microphone or does something funny for a while. But Rudy, he was just, you know, just like you talk about a Charlie Parker playing the saxophone, Rudy Van Gelder was a genius like that as being a recording engineer. And he really was the most, out of all the recording engineers on any of the recording sessions I ever appeared on, the Van Gelder sound and what he was able to get out of the thing. But Rudy was very fussy about him. Don't mess with his equipment, you know. Because one day I was trying to, I accidentally leaned forward and it stopped the take that we were doing because the bridge of my bass hit the microphone, and we stopped, and I went to reach down to change the mic, and Rudy came out of the control booth, and he said, "Oh no, Larry, no, no!" I thought he was going to have a heart attack, and I said, "What's happening, Rudy?" He said, "No, don't touch the microphones, don't let me do it, I said, "Okay, Rudy." But I mean, he was very, very fussy about don't be messing with the equipment and stuff like that. If anybody felt that there was an adjustment needed, to let him do it. Don't be, guys didn't manhandle his stuff. He didn't like that.
When you knew a recording session was coming up, you'd rehearse for a couple of days, and then Alfred Lyon would come in, and would they give you any information? Would they give you any opinion or critique, or they trusted that whatever you guys were doing with Freddie Hubbard or Jackie McLean was going to be fine when you get in the studio? How much input did they have?
Well, they basically were just there to sort of, I guess they were taking notes, mental notes or whatever, in terms of what they were listening to the music and what was being rehearsed. And they didn't really interfere a lot with that, but they were always there. They were very thorough, and that's one of the things that I liked about them too. And both of them just seemed to have a sixth sense about what they were looking for and how they felt about the music, because that's why I think that there were so many great recordings that came out from Blue Note that were produced by Alfred and Frank,
So they knew when to give input and when to lean back and let the musicians do what they do.
Yeah, well, they were pretty cool. And another guy whose name has to be mentioned is Ike Quebec, the tenor saxophonist, because Ike Quebec, great tenor saxophone player, was the guy that was really sort of the main go-between between the musicians, and he would always, like kind of oversee and make sure that everything was cool,
As you recorded in Rudy Van Gelder's studio, at the end of the session, were there any acetates pressed or copies that the musicians or the Alfred Lyon were able to take home?
That part I don't remember. I don't really want to venture a guess on that. I don't know what happened after, we wrapped up and finished doing whatever we were doing recording wise. But I'm trying to remember, because it seems like on one occasion at some point we did get an opportunity to hear what they had done as far as the final mixing or stuff like that. But that was primarily what happened with whoever the leader of the recording date was involved in terms of that particular session where they got together and sort of listened to stuff. But Alfred and Frank both, they had a really just a natural instinct of knowing what they wanted to hear and get out of the sessions. So they were very much a part of the sessions. I have to give them their props. It wasn't all just the musicians. Like they created an environment that was very comfortable, so that you knew when you were going to do a date for Blue Note Records that it was just a comfortable experience all the way around.
So it was very different for Blue Note than it was in some of the other sessions you may have done for folks like Savoy or Riverside.
Yeah, well, each one of them and the person who was in charge, had their own particular style, of coordinating and leading and setting up the whole environment of what you were involved with. But Blue Note just had I've recorded for several labels, but the Blue Note was like a family. And Frank and Alfred were just like big brothers, because they were really nice to all of us, and they set up an environment to really get the most out. I think that's one of the reasons why the Blue Note sessions, for the most part that I've ever listened to, they always have a certain kind of feeling, that Blue Note sound and feeling, because they knew what they wanted to get out of it. And then, like I say, Ike Quebec, the great tenor saxophonist, who was like their sort of musical coordinator, he was also there to help them get a lot of what they were able to get out of the musicians, and also what ended up being the final product.
In my reading up on Blue Note records, it always strikes me that Alfred and Frank and even Rudy Van Gelder, they were all fans first and businessmen second. I think that's what comes
true
for me. Yeah.
I think you're absolutely correct. That was a part of the mix. I mean, they were some out of the many different recordings that I've done for different labels and stuff like that. I'd have to give them their props. I mean, it was more like a family, in my opinion, with Blue Note, as opposed to some of the other record labels that it did. That just stuff with Herman Lubinsky with Savoy and all that. And he was pretty cool. He was a very interesting guy.
When you did a recording for Blue Note, and obviously at the end of the session, everyone's packing up, you've all probably got to go to gigs back in Manhattan. At what point did you get a copy of the recording? Like, for instance, did one day, a few copies of Jackie McLean Destination Out appear? Did you get handed? How did you get the final version of the record? Or
mainly only the artist who was the leader on the date would get copy before they put out the final product, and that's the way it worked in my experience. Like particularly with most of the recording companies, whoever was the coordinator.
So Jackie McLean or Freddie Hubbard would just have to catch up with you at one point and say, "Oh, here's a copy of this," or did you have to go buy them?
Oh no, we didn't have to buy them, but a lot of them I didn't really hear until after they were finished product.
Mm-hmm.
But like with Freddie, because Freddie and I were homeboys, we grew up together. Sometime he would get one of the advanced copies, the test pressing that was going to be the final product, and he would let me hear it because we were, like I say, Freddie and I were like brothers, and so I was close to him. But some of the other guys, I mean, I never was privy to anything until the recording itself came out. For the most part, I may have had something with as far as Jackie McLean, maybe, but mostly it was the guys that I was really close with, particularly like Freddie Hubbard.
Mm. Do you still have all those old records from the day?
You mean the prototypes?
The prototypes or the original pressings that you bought or obtained in the early to mid 60s?
I do have quite a few of those things. Yes, I do.
Wow.
Yes, I do. As far as my collection, I've got a whole bunch of CDs. And my wife is always telling me keep it together because she's a wonderful lady, who loves me. But sometimes I can be leaving stuff laying around, and she doesn't like that, So
believe me,
keep that under your head.
Don't worry. That's by the way, Larry. That's no secret. We all have that conversation with our wives, so don't worry.
Oh, listen, she's the reason why I'm still alive because I went through my little period of acting silly and crazy before I met her, But for the most part, I've always been pretty cool,
Good.
I haven't developed any bad habits, but I used to like to have my little tastes, and stuff like that. But
you played with so many legendary musicians, and a lot of them really did have some pretty nasty habits. How did you avoid that?
Well, just being myself trying to be a nice guy, because I don't like a lot of drama. I'm not a drama king. I try to maintain a certain level of stability and And I don't have a big ego. I'm very confident in who and what I am and my knowledge, but I'm always open to be an eternal student.
But you got folks like Lee, who certainly had a drug habit. Did you ever talk to them about it? Were you ever able to have that sort of conversation, or you just let them do what they're going to do and just look after your own self?
You talking about Lee?
Or Lee, or any of the other musicians that were in a similar situation?
No, I never really got into a thing with guys about that, because guys had their own personal business, and we were like a big family though. All those guys, we knew how far to go in terms of, at least speaking for myself, that it wasn't a thing of trying to be super hip or anything like that. It was just, hey, what's going on? And all the musicians were guys that were interested in politics and all kinds of stuff, and art and things like that, and I just thank God, man, that and I have to thank my parents too for raising me the way they did, and my family,
Well, I would say so, because to be able to venture off into that lifestyle and to be in the situations and the crowds and just the circumstances you were in, and be able to navigate that individually and keep your head together and stay true to yourself and your values, that means that at a very early age, your folks really influenced that and put that in you in order for you to be able to function that way. So that is direct result of proper parenting.
That's true. That's true. Very true.
So let's take a few moments to talk about Lee Morgan. What was Lee like?
Lee was, like a young genius. I mean, he came on the scene when he was about 17 or 18 years old, and Dizzy Gillespie was the one that introduced him. I mean, outside of the Philadelphia scene, and that it was straight ahead from that point forward. But Lee was a very, very intelligent guy, and his approach to the instrument was very unique, and that's one of the things I miss in a lot of younger players today. That I don't hear them getting their individual type of sound on the instrument. I mean, when I hear Lee Morgan, I know it's Lee Morgan. I can recognize his sound, his tone, the timbre of his instrument, and his approach, the way he breathes, the way he plays his lines, and with any of the musicians, But that's one of the things. I'm going to make a little sidebar on this, even though I've been involved in jazz education for some time. Some of these jazz degree programs, they have their little formulaic way of teaching jazz, and in many cases they don't impress upon the players to find themselves and find their own individual approach. Is that they go with a particular formulaic technique about how they do it, So, and I always teasingly say that sometimes they want you to play the idiot scales and mix a little syncopation with it, and you're playing instant jazz, But I miss the fact that when you heard Ben Webster, you know that sound, his approach, how he develops his lines, his interpretations, versus Coleman Hawkins or Sonny Rollins or John Coltrane or Hank Mobley, Paul Gonsalves, on and on and on. We can name names on each of the instruments. And finding your own voice, to me, is something that's very important. And I don't claim to know what the magic potion is as far as that's concerned, other than to thine own self be true, and not try to just copy something that you've heard somebody else play. Yeah, we all borrow a little bit here. My early stuff was transcribing in my head certain lines or approaches or concepts that Ray Brown or Oscar Pettiford or Paul Chambers or Doug Watkins, on and on, Milt Hinton. And, and I've learned a lot from all these people. And, you sort of incorporate, it becomes a part of building your vocabulary. So that when you're asked to make a statement, you're speaking from the sum total of the many parts that you have in terms of your knowledge of music and how you would wish to express yourself.
So you mentioned that that's something you don't hear in modern times as often as back in the day. What do you think that missing piece is?
Well, I think some of it is I attribute to like the jazz education programs or techniques. I mean, I think some of these people just immediately take the little techniques of the way it's outlined, and they will use that to express themselves rather than just, it's just like language. You don't have to sit down every day and rehearse all the words that go starting from A to Z. You have all this in your mind, and you use all of that in order to express yourself. It is the same thing with music. Instead of trying to just imitate somebody, and we all borrow a little bit of what we've heard from different artists, but each and every time you play, that's the beautiful thing I've always loved about jazz, because you're improvising at that moment. It doesn't matter what you played last week or what you played on a record. Now, I played with one or two musicians that used to always want to play the solos that they played on the records, and you go on a gig with them and they want to just play that. And in fact, there's one musician, I won't mention his name, but I used to always tell him, and I worked with him, and he played the same damn solo on the tune every night, every time we played it. And I said, man, why do you do that? He said, well, them people buy my records, and that's what they want to hear. I said, come on, man, this is jazz.
Could it be that in previous decades, people used the instrument, really approached the instrument with a different motivation? For instance, they wanted to play the instrument. They wanted to master the instrument. They didn't have so much of a compulsion to be famous or to be known from it. They used it more for expression. Whereas I think in more modern times, there's a big focus on being known. I mean, the whole social media, Facebook and Instagram, all these different technologies and applications are more about drawing attention to oneself. So the people who are playing instruments now tend to have a little bit more of their minds focused on how the instrument can draw attention to themselves rather than simply using it as a form of expression.
Well, there's a lot to what you just said. That's very true. Exactly. Because the beautiful thing I've always liked about being a jazz musician and playing jazz is the ability to be spontaneous at any given moment and not thinking in terms, okay, I know that this lick works over a B flat 7 chord or over a C minor 7 chord or whatever, and breaking it down like that, and I'm going to write out a line, or I'm just going to come up with one line that covers, you're expressing yourself in that particular harmonic moment, but, the spontaneity of improvising at the moment is what's mostly important. That's, all the masters that God has blessed me with being able to play with, they weren't playing stuff, like just set licks that they had put together, or, that's been the beauty of jazz, is the spontaneity of improvising at the moment, whatever you feel. Because every time you get on the bandstand, every time you pick up your instrument, it's from that moment forward. It's not about, oh, well, last week I played this on my improvisation over Donna Lee or Blue Moon or whatever, No, That's the beauty. It's like language. You and I are talking now. We haven't rehearsed it. You haven't rehearsed your dialogue, and I haven't rehearsed my dialogue. We're having a conversation, and that's what I like to engage in. And most of the major musicians that I play with, is what the conversation is at that given moment.
Well, I think there's a factor of how comfortable you are with risk. If you're a musician, a jazz musician, and you're up there expressing yourself, being, as you say, spontaneous, then there is, it comes with it a bit of a embracing of the fear of failure. You may not hit the right note. You may hit a clam, but that's kind of part of the experience. And if you're comfortable with that potential result, then you can be much more expressive. If you're not comfortable, if you want to make sure you hit all those notes correct, then you're going to plan it out. And that's where you get the musicians who play the same solo every night, because stepping outside of that introduces the risk and the fear of failure and the potential humility in front of a crowd of hitting a wrong note. So I think that plays a factor in how comfortable you are as a jazz musician, is how comfortable you are with risk.
Exactly. No, I totally agree with you, because, what we did yesterday, that's gone. That's history. It's behind us. The spontaneity of just living life is the constantly changing thing. You have to be comfortable within yourself that you've studied and you have your sum total of your experiences and what you've done, and just allowing yourself to be confident to go ahead and just express yourself however you feel at the moment. Just like you and I talking as we have, the questions you've asked me and your comments that you've made and the comments that I've made, we're improvising at the moment. And so, there's some people who, for a variety of reasons, they don't feel comfortable with having to improvise. I've known people like that. They're very uneasy in certain circumstances because they either have like a certain degree of not being comfortable with being themselves, or willing to just take a chance and respond spontaneously, because we're constantly improvising. The whole conversation that you and I are having is spontaneous improvisation at the moment.
Life is improvisation.
Hello. Long distance calling. You got that right.
So let's, speaking of improvising and taking risks and living on the edge, back to Lee Morgan. Mm-hmm. When did you first start interacting with Lee? When did you meet Lee?
Oh, I met Lee when I first came to New York. We
so
knew
he was
each
still a
other,
teenager.
because there was a whole little fraternity of musicians, and if you were a guy who was capable of musically to be on a certain level, you just strike up a dialogue, and you just keep the dialogue going throughout your association with each other, whether it's on the bandstand or just in conversations or whatever,
So you met him as a teenager.
Yeah, he was, let's see, boy, I don't know how old we were. We were all teenagers back in that time. I don't remember how old I was when I first met him, but we were all young guys, he and Freddie Hubbard, and oh man, and I remember when Herbie Hancock came on the scene, there's a whole bunch of guys, and Jackie McLean, oh man, just name names. We were all at different levels age-wise, but it was just a matter of feeling comfortable with the association, and then also, thing that I've always tried to tell young musicians, don't come forward with any phony baloney, because, you might get shot down,
Mm-hmm. With Lee, what was his personality like? He was young, he was on fire, he recorded these brilliant albums before he was 22. Was there an arrogance Did you see his frame of mind change through those years?
Well, he was very confident, and he was a young guy, you know, who just was extremely talented. You know, you run into these young people who could be even younger, who just have some natural mother wit or ability to like really be super duper about whatever it is. You know, sometimes you know how you meet a kid sometimes, and you start conversation with them, and you say, "Wait a minute, how do they know this?" You know, like say a 10-year-old that speaks with the confidence of being like 18 or 19 or even older. You know.
What do you recall from the sessions for the Cornbread LP?
Well, the thing was that, Lee brought out the tunes that he wanted to do, and we just like had a few rundowns and just getting familiar with the melodies and the chord changes, the tempos, all of the various factors of that's involved in it. And then it's just a matter of engaging in sort of like a group dialogue where everybody knows what their role is. I mean, if I'm the bass player, I'm responsible for creating improvised, spontaneous lines that outline the chordal sequence and also related to the melody, and trying to make the lines that I play have some sort of contrapuntal aspect to the melody that I'm playing at that given moment, because, I wouldn't play the same thing that I would play on, say, a tune like Cherokee versus I Got It Bad and That Ain't Good, So each tune that it calls for a different approach, but to relax and just know what your role is. It's like being on a basketball team, Everybody can't be the center and everybody can't be the point guard,
But perhaps going counter to what we just said about improvisation and risk-taking, I imagine early on when you're doing the rehearsals, you're kind of working out where you're going to fit in, what you're going to do. There's the basic theme you have to follow, and then an understanding of the boundaries that you have around that to improvise. And however, when you get to recording it, I imagine there's quite a bit of agreement by that point in terms of what's going to go where and the levels of improvisation between the different instruments. Would I understand that right? Or when you get in the studio,
no, I think that's
okay.
I hear what you're saying, and that's true. You become familiar with what the topic of this, thinking just like even if it's a verbal situation, what is the topic and the subject matter, and that you are expected to improvise on that in order to, and then to fit in with what you're doing and knowing your role, R-O-L-E, and what you're expected to do, because in the rhythm section, the bass player has to play lines that are contrapuntal to what the chordal structure is, and at the same time, you're involved in listening to whoever is soloing as well, so that your line has a particular unique inclusion within that total mix. I guess it's like mixing some Jell-O or something. Yeah, you got to stir it up and then put it in the freezer and let it gel. I don't know. That might not be a good analogy, but you know what I mean.
I don't know if it's a good analogy either, but you sure are making me hungry. Sorry
about that.
No, so if you, and I guess with the bass player, you've got to hold it down a little bit. You've got a little bit more responsibility. The horn player can kind of, they've got their main themes, but when they do a solo, it's, they could fly pretty much wherever they want. As a bass player, you've got a responsibility to hold it down with a little bit more, dare I say, a limited boundary of which you can kind of improvise and throw in a few things here and there. But your job is really to make sure that foundation is strong so the other instruments can soar.
Well, again, I use like athletic metaphors. If I'm the first baseman on a baseball team, then I've got to hold down that position and everything that comes my way, whether the batter in the box hits the ball and it comes my way at first base, or if it goes to the shortstop, then I have to position myself to get to put my foot on the bag so that the shortstop throws the ball to me, so I put the person out that's at batting. And so there's always that kind of, it's like a team interplay kind of situation. Everybody has a role.
So, Larry, I do want to thank you very much for spending time with us here. One last question before I let you go there, Dr. Ridley. You've obviously you are into sports. You've used a few sports analogies today. You've heard of fantasy football, where people put together the different players from different eras and different teams to form a pretend team to play against other people's pretend teams, fantasy football.
I've heard about that, yeah.
Let's play a little bit of fantasy jazz band, okay?
Okay.
You get to have it, St. Peter says, guess what? You get to form a jazz band, you on bass, but you get to pick all the other instruments.
Oh, my goodness. Boy, on each of the instruments, the list is long, because you're dealing like with individuals and their own particular signature. Like if I'm playing in a group like, say, Randy Weston is the pianist, and say Billy Higgins is the drummer. We're going to respond to each other based upon our own individual concepts and bringing something together so that we unite and make a particular statement at any given moment. And it'll vary from musician to musician because different guys have different ways. It's like the way Red Garland would play a comp on the piano when you're backing a soloist. He had a particular style of the way he would set up the comping rhythms that he would use versus, say, Randy Weston or Thelonious or Herbie Hancock or...
So I'll make it easy. How about if this one is just the first set, okay? And maybe this is you improvising right now. Who would you like to see on drums?
Oh boy. Well, not necessarily in this order, but I could name like I'd always loved playing with Philly Joe Jones, Roy Haynes, Billy Higgins, Tony Williams, Alan Dawson.
Only one could be on the kit at a given time, So you got Philly Joe Jones. Okay, who's on trumpet?
With Philly Joe?
Yep.
Either Lee or Freddie or Miles or Dizzy.
Okay, we'll go with Lee and Freddie. Saxophone.
John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins, Lucky Thompson.
All right, Coltrane and Rollins. Piano.
Piano, Red Garland, Thelonious.
Yep.
Bud Powell. Herbie Hancock, Cedar Walton, Harold Mayburn.
All right, so here we go. Here's our fantasy jazz band. Philly Joe Jones on drums, Lee Morgan and Freddie on trumpet, Coltrane and Rollins on saxophone, Red Garland, Thelonious on piano, and Dr. Larry Ridley on bass. I'd love to see that, wouldn't you?
Oh, you just said, I'd love it. Can you make that happen?
Well, I'll see what I can do. I'll pull some strings here. But That's incredible. So,
You
Larry,
say you'll pull some strings
I'll pull some
on the bass?
Oh, you don't want me
I'm
on
sorry.
the bass. You don't want me on the bass. That fantasy would turn into a tragedy jazz band. So that would be... All right, Dr. Larry Ridley, thank you very much for joining us. Much appreciated. And
Oh,
thanks
my
for spending
pleasure. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed our conversation, and let's keep them coming.
Cheers.